Hi, my name is Mallory Jenner Robinson. Join me on a Hateful Homicide, a true crime and investigative journalism podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders and hate crimes of our transgender, non-binary, intersex, and two-spirit community members in the United States and abroad. This is a Hateful Homicide.
Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best of any podcasts. I'm Starry, and you're listening to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ.
Hey, it's for horses and for cows when horses aren't around. And don't be shocked if I swear occasionally. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors, and welcome to Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ+. I'm your fun-loving host, CJ. I hope you all have been well. My girl Sherry Lynn pointed out that my pronunciation of a city in Massachusetts was a little tainted last episode. So I stand to correct. The name of the city is Gloucester rather than Gloucester. You know, she also added a little insight to something that's happening to podcasters via Apple reviews and to authors on Amazon reviews of their books. They're all getting crappy reviews. And that's because she learned that there's people all over the globe using VPNs to mislead others where the posts are coming from. And then they post shit reviews, such as the ones I got. Sherry Lynn's a pretty smart cookie, so I'm apt to believe it very well could be this. But it's most likely haters. And I want to thank all of you who reached out to me and said, hey, we like you. Don't take the bad reviews personally. I really do love my Rainbow Warriors. You're all the best. And as I told my Patreon members, I went to the doctor for the first time in 5 years. I have a pretty bad sinus infection. I'm feeling better today. But the reason this episode is a bit late is because the sinus infection, it's been making me really queasy for some reason. But while I was in Portland, I was DM'd by the sister of a man that I covered as a True Crime Quickie back in season 11. It was the episode titled The Louisiana Pizza Kitchen Murders. The sister is named Nicole and her brother was Timothy Ridpath of Missouri. The case was originally suggested to me by someone who had went to school with Timothy and his sister Nicole. And that someone was kind enough to supply me with newspaper articles. Unfortunately, as we know, media doesn't always get the story correct. So with Nicole's help, I will be revisiting Timothy's case this episode, and hopefully be able to present it with a little more accuracy and some insider insights. Nicole's already shared information with me that I truly didn't know about the case. And trust me, if you even remember my sharing the case before, it's going to be like hearing the case for the first time. But first, I'm going to set Tim's story up again to refresh our memories of the case. Timothy Keith Ridpath was born October 6, 1970 in Missouri. He was born to Dewey and Twyla, making Tim a Libra. Now, before Dewey was married to Twyla, he was married to his high school sweetheart named Pat. And when Dewey was first married to Pat, they had a son in 1967. They named that baby Timothy Keith Ridpath, but this child only survived 2 days. 3 years later, Dewey and Pat had divorced, and Dewey married Twyla, and the young man that we'll be discussing in this episode's case was born, his name, Timothy Keith Ridpath. A year later, Nicole was born. 12 years after they had married, Dewey and Twyla ended up divorcing, and Dewey remarried his first wife, Pat. Dewey and Pat gave Tim and Nicole another sister, a stepsister named Penny, and I believe that there was one more girl that was also born to them. And that's pretty much the family dynamics. The family lived in Independence, Missouri, which is the county seat of Jackson County and just south of Kansas City, so almost to the Missouri-Kansas borderline. At the age of 18, Tim was a petite young man, standing just 5 feet 4 inches, and he weighed about 120 pounds. Dewey, Tim and Nicole's father, he's since passed, But while he was alive, he said that Tim was pretty ornery, but he couldn't understand what would lead anyone to kill him. 19-year-old Christopher Mitchell went to high school and later college with Tim. The two young men had known each other for about 2 years. Chris had a girlfriend, 17-year-old Cindy. Cindy was friends with Tim also, and Nicole had graduated with Cindy. Even though Chris had a girlfriend, he and Tim would hook up for sexual interaction. Chris obviously knew that Tim was either gay, bisexual, or that he had tendencies other than the heterosexual norm. In the 2 years that they were friends, they had sex at least 4 times, as learned by Chris's admission. Before graduation, Tim had complained to a teacher that he was having a feud with Chris, and he was fearful that Chris would hurt him. This could have been possibly because Tim threatened to out Chris to his girlfriend and to other people. The summer of 1989 had just flown by, and Tim was getting ready for college at CMSU, Central Missouri State University, which is now known as UCM, University of Central Missouri. He was excited to study business. Upon attending freshman orientation, who should Tim see at the orientation but Chris? Another altercation ensued, but this time it turned into physical violence. The result of the fight was Tim receiving an injured jaw. The campus security had to come break the fight up, and both Tim and Chris would be suspended from attending that college for a year. The college campus security also called Tim and Nicole's mom Twyla and her new husband Jerry. At that moment, both Twyla and Jerry learned about Tim's sexual romps with Chris, and about Tim's possible gay identity, and of the volatile relationship Tim had with Chris. Jerry had huge problems with the LGBTQ, apparently. This made Twyla feel forced to choose between her 18-year-old son and her new husband, Jerry. Jerry won. Tim was kicked out of their house, and he went to live with his dad, Dewey, and his again wife, Pat. Nicole had already been living with her dad for a year, but she missed her friends, and she ended up moving back to her mom's so that she could be closer to her friends. But absolutely nobody in the family shared any of this with Nicole, and Nicole didn't ask. In fact, it wasn't until the trial of Tim's murder that she found all of it out. On October 1st, Chris called Tim. He told him that he wanted to talk. Tim agreed to meet Chris. That same night, Chris picked up his girlfriend Cindy from work. Then they went to the movie theater in town. Cindy left the car and she ran up to the theater and purchased tickets for the movie Black Rain. The attendee at the ticket counter told her that the movie had already started, but Cindy said that was fine and she purchased the tickets. She told the attendee she would be right back with her boyfriend. However, the attendee at the theater was pretty perplexed when she didn't return with her boyfriend. As Tim met up with Chris had ordered Cindy to stay out of Tim's view. And then Chris told Tim to follow him out to a rural county road where they could talk. This deserted road just happened to be nearly an hour away in Lawrence, Kansas. When they got to the place that Chris had in mind, he stopped his truck along the side of the road, and Tim pulled up behind him and did the same. Cindy was still hiding in Chris's vehicle, and she heard Chris unzip a duffel bag, and then he left the truck and went back to Tim's car. As Chris opened Tim's passenger side door, Cindy heard a shot from the gun, something she described in court as a faint tap, like a tap on a table. Tim had been shot in his abdomen. Tim then opened his door and he tried to run, and then Cindy heard 4 more shots or faint taps. Each shot struck Tim as he tried to escape his attacker. Chris came back to his vehicle where Cindy had remained. He opened the door and he shakily got into the car. He told Cindy, "I can't believe I shot him." 5 gunshots into Tim was definitely overkill. And since we know who was behind it, it was definitely a crime of passion. Tim's body was found laying next to his car the following day on October 2nd by a farmer in the vicinity. Tim was laid to rest on October 5th. Initially, police couldn't figure out why Tim's body was found in Lawrence, Kansas. As far as they could tell, Tim had no ties to Lawrence, Kansas at all. They had ruled out suicide early on. They had also ruled out robbery, as it appeared that nothing of Tim's was stolen from him other than his life. They were also pretty sure that the murder was not drug-related. So 18 sheriff deputies and the Kansas City Bureau of Investigation agents, or KBI, they went to work on the case. Per her initial account of the story, it would seem that Cindy had no idea that Chris had intentions to murder Tim. But again, that was her initial story. And she went along with Chris's plan. She said it was because she was scared. But we're never quite sure if it was because Cindy was in fear of Chris, or if she was in fear for Chris, or both. Or maybe neither. Maybe she was afraid she would get in trouble. But here's the thing with that. Cindy seemed to know that the movie tickets that she was purchasing, they were to timestamp an alibi for her and Chris. So I'd have to say, really, Cindy? You had no idea of Chris's plan. With Tim's body being found on that county road on October 2nd, the day after Chris had savagely murdered Tim, Chris and Cindy hid the gun in some bushes at Chris's house. A few days later, the gun was disassembled and it was wrapped in cloth and thrown in the Missouri River. Soon after Tim's death, both Chris and Cindy were brought in for questioning. They were each asked to consent to polygraph tests, which they did, but both of them failed the test miserably. To top it off, Chris had been love-bombing Cindy like crazy after he murdered Tim. He was buying her gifts, taking her to restaurants, and even talking to her about wanting a long-term relationship. Cindy seemed over the top in love with Chris, and the love bombing was solidifying it even more. Up until the KBI approached Cindy. They told her about Chris having a homosexual relationship with Tim. But what really made Cindy even angrier was that they told her about another relationship Chris was having with a different girl named Stacy. Stacy was Cindy and Chris's friend, and now Chris was wooing her too, taking her to dinner, giving her gifts, etc. And it sounds almost a little humorous too, because the KBI agents, they would be dining at tables right next to Chris and Stacy. But the young couple, they were oblivious to it. Chris only had eyes for his conquest of the moment. The KBI were tailing Chris to see if he would possibly lead them to key evidence in the case. But instead, he led them to his fucked up life priorities of screwing around with two girls at once after he murdered his friend and sometimes lover. Meanwhile, Cindy was stressed out to the max. On Thanksgiving of 1989, she fainted while she was in the shower. She just couldn't bear the horror of the night that Tim was murdered anymore. She told her parents everything. Her parents contacted the Kansas City Bureau of Investigations, and her parents agreed that Cindy would testify, but in return she would be granted immunity. And the KBI was okay with it as long as Cindy agreed to take another polygraph test. Cindy did agree, and this time she passed. Chris was arrested at his home in the early morning hours just after Thanksgiving. He was charged with first-degree murder, and his bond was set at $500,000. Chris's family got him the best defense attorney they could. The attorney was a former prosecutor who did his damnedest to portray Cindy as a scorned woman and a liar who was only out for revenge. This attorney's sabotage of Cindy's credibility was extremely successful because it placed seeds of doubt into the jurors' heads. The prosecution remained focused on the homosexual relationship between Chris and Tim, and that the fact Chris was going to be outed for that relationship was motive enough for Chris to have murdered Tim. However, Chris's defense attorney claimed that once the police put Chris in their sights, no one else was even looked at, including another young man who claimed he was the killer of Tim. This young man was Scott Burke, whose stepsister happened to be a police officer. Scott was attending the University of Kansas at the time, and the stepsister, whose name is Jan, said that nearly 2 weeks after Tim's murder, her stepbrother said jokingly, "Yeah, I shot that guy. I got mad and shot him." The defense attorney asked Jan if joking about homicide is funny, and she replied, "I can't decide his humor for him." But she also admitted that he asked her several days before Tim's murder what the laws were for carrying a weapon around in his car. A friend of Scott's testified that he struck up a conversation with Scott, and he asked Scott if the police investigations bothered him. Scott said, "No, but the next time I talk to those guys, I'm going to tell them I did it and I threw the gun in the Kansas River." I don't personally think Scott's the one who killed Tim. I think Scott's either an idiot who has a very inappropriate sense of humor, or Scott has some underlying mental issues. However, I do believe the police arrested the right killer the first time, and that killer was put on trial for the crime he committed, although Chris maintained his innocence throughout the trial. Evidence was presented by the prosecution. One was in the form of a ballistics forensic test. It showed 2 bullets from a wall in Chris's dad's car dealership that matched the bullets found in Tim's body. All of the bullets were from the same small caliber gun. The other evidence came in the form of another witness. The Kansas City Turnpike employee testified that they remembered Chris crossing the turnpike into Kansas. But at the end of the trial, the defense attorney won over the jury. After about 4.5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Chris not guilty by reasonable doubt, and he was acquitted. Some say he used the gay panic defense as well. But if you consensually have sex with someone who is of the same gender, how can that be gay panic? And by his own admission, they had consensual sex 4 times. After the verdict was read, Chris and his mother tearfully hugged each other while Chris glared hatefully at Cindy for testifying against them. Chris told the media he was scared because he was on trial for something he didn't do, and with his acquittal, justice had been served. What a damn narcissistic thing to say, Chris. Because there was zero unicorn justice for Timothy Keith Ridpath, his murder will go unavenged and with no consequences for his killer. I'd like to thank Nicole again, Tim's sister, for helping me to get some of the facts more accurate. We were supposed to connect again so she could share a little bit more with me, but unfortunately that just didn't happen. Rest in power, Tim. Our True Crime Quickie is from West Palm Beach, Florida in 2017. Carlotta Crowell was a 36-year-old lesbian with an 11-year-old daughter named Kyra. Kyra has been described as a quiet, observant, artistic, and spunky girl. But at school, she had some peers that she didn't really get along with. One of these girls was the daughter of a man named Marlon Joseph. Interestingly enough, 26-year-old Marlon happened to be the son of Carlotta's girlfriend. So it seemed that there were ties connecting the two girls, Kyra and Marlon's daughter, other than just being classmates. I hate you because my grandma is your mom's girlfriend, that kind of stuff. But the turmoil definitely could have been for other things as well. Nevertheless, the young girl's volatile relationship isn't really the key point to take away from this case, although it did have some to do with how the situation turned out. On December 28, 2017, Marlon went over to Carlotta's home. Carlotta and Kyra were both home at the time. Marlon lived with his mother and family. Marlon had told his mother if there was another incident between his daughter and Kyra, he was going to have to take care of it himself. So when there was another incident, You can imagine Marlon was pretty amped up over the discord going on between his daughter and Kyra. Collada and Marlon began to argue heatedly at Collada's home. This is when Collada's mama bear came out, and Marlon, who in this instance took on the role of the hunter, shot Collada in her house multiple times in front of Kyra. While watching in horror, Kyra's fight or flight kicked in quickly. She ran out the door outside, and she kept running until Marlon caught up with her, and he shot her 5 times. And it really infuriates me that this poor little girl had to endure so much terror. First by witnessing her mom blasted away by this angry man, but then to be running for her own life. I just can't even imagine the fear that must have been flowing through her in those final moments. Neither Collada or Kyra would survive the violent gun attack by Marlon that fateful day. Marlon then took Collada's car and he fled the scene. The following day, U.S. Marshals captured Marlon in the West Palm Beach neighborhood of Lantana. This came after an announcement for a $5,000 reward leading to the arrest of Marlon. It would appear that his acquaintances needed $5,000 more than they needed him. After his arrest and charges for 2 counts of first-degree murder and felony possession of a firearm, because Marlon had a prior arrest record, his trial did not start right away. Not only that, it concluded 3 years after the murder of Collada and Kyra in 2020. The jury found Marlon unanimously guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. Marlon currently sits on death row, and he is the first to be sentenced to death in West Palm Beach, Florida since 2002. Rest in power, Collada and Kyra. I love you, Rainbow Warriors. You matter, and I'll try to be on time next week. Remember, it's not a crime to be gay or to live your truth, unless you're a murderer.